to Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. In this show, we dig into the societal upheavals in recent U.S. history that have left so many feeling lost, angry, or hopeless, and explore how our nation became so unmoored. At the heart of this upheaval is a major debate over how to build a society where everyone can thrive. Our host is history professor and theologian Carl Kreisman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative exetive.
Hi, Matthew. How's it going?
Hey, Carl. Doing all right, man.
Good. Things are going good.
Yes, indeed.
We're halfway. Well, I shouldn't say halfway because we may not get to 10, but this is episode 5.
Yeah.
So we're into the halfway point, and we've been examining kind of the crisis that we're in, or that I think we're in, and the challenge that comes from losing touch with history. And we last time looked at some ancient documents that described another group of people who saw themselves as God's chosen people, people of God, found themselves moving from majority culture to minority culture. And so we kind of looked at kind of why that happened and how, like, the individual has a role to play. If you're going to claim this faith position, then there's an expectation from you about how to do that.
Right, and how we can't just default to it's an external force that is acting itself upon.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a victim. I have no agency. It's, I need to look at this external problem versus look inside first.
Yeah.
You might have more to change than you might realize.
Yeah,
and us putting ourselves in that category.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea that how I live within my faith is important, and we've kind of tied that into some data that we looked at like 2 or 3 episodes ago about the change in, if you kind of measure the standing of say spirituality or Christianity or adherents amongst U.S. citizens from say World War II to today. It's been in steep decline, but the numbers are so great that if we say society has changed on a variety of culture points, drug usage, for instance, or as I've talked about, a pursuit of ease and luxury and wealth and consumerism. Well, if 90% of the culture believed in something that was a faith position of moderation, then we shouldn't have seen the impact. But it did have an impact, and it's a massive impact. So we've raised, and I've tried to demonstrate both within our current data and then using this historical documents and information, that is probably a failure within, right, rather than an attack from without.
And so in that situation, there's at least 2 paths forward. One is that kind of self-reflection and seeing, did I drift? Did we drift? Kind of seeing how we need to course correct. Or back to that, looking at the external forces as the enemy, and we're the, uninvolved victims in the thing. And if you go down that course, then possibly overgeneralizing. But I feel like that is the path that leads it to saying, hey, there's an outside force that has changed our culture, our world to a way we don't like it. Our only resource is to link arms, amass all the power that we can, and enact our will on the culture as a whole. And it's just, a few subway stops down from there that would lead to this idea of Christian nationalism, which, we have examined it a little bit. We will more, but there's some obvious holes in that. A question I have that may relate to what we're going to talk about, may take us right down a rabbit trail, but something that's come up for me is this. Picture 2 different people. So one person, let's say, is in that Christian nationalist camp. They feel like they have a mission, and that is to elect all the Christian or Christian-friendly politicians they can. We need to put our people in the positions of power to enact our policies toward the end of arranging the chessboard to where it reflects our views, our beliefs, our desires. We need to take the reins of power, and then we'll enact the change that we want to see. Okay, that's over here. Over here, you could have a Christian who says, look, politics are not the solution to the problem, but at the same time, I'm a steward. I am responsible for my house, my money, my children, my community, by extension, you roll it out far enough, I'm responsible to a tiny degree, but I'm a steward of my country. I am obligated to do whatever's in my power to be responsible. And in the pursuit of that, I'm going to vote, I'm going to advocate for things that I feel like will take us in the most healthiest direction. So kind of a material difference in mindset, but both these people in practice could be wanting a lot of the same things. So there's no question to that. It's more of, just what do we do with that? For example, Christian nationalists might want the Bible to be taught in school towards the end of kind of a proselytizing point of view. Okay. This other person go, well, yeah, the Bible should be in school because, well, it's a historic document and it greatly colored what we understand as Western culture. They both want the same thing for different reasons, but in the end, they're still advocating for kind of similar stuff. Is there a difference between the two?
Well, I think there is on the point that you said initially, the thought process. But I think if you follow the thought process and you press it, you begin to raise the question of, well, what about the person in a multicultural society who doesn't agree?
Right.
Right. So in a Christian nationalist point of view, it's like, yep, too bad, so sad. Don't like it, leave. Or arguably, at least hypothetically, worse. Whereas the first person, I think, would have a different answer, or the second person that you described would have a different answer, to that question. Yeah. What you're really touching on is something we are going to get to, probably in our last episode, when we're saying kind of, well, then what do we do, right? How does a person interface? And we're probably going to have 2 or 3 solutions that I hope to offer. We used the Jewish prophet Jeremiah last time we talked about him, and he has, I believe, some very helpful advice about what a group of people could do that their God told them to do while they were in this time of exile. And you could simplify it by saying that you kind of are to live for the flourishing of the society. So that could get into your question, and we could take it away from should the Bible be in school, right, to a question of how do we help people have better financial management? And there's perhaps different answers for that may or may not need to lean on a Christian perspective. But in simple terms, as I've already said in one of the other episodes, the Christian faith is a faith that suggests that its followers should have moderation, self-moderation, but it's moderation that sort of is imposed or taught by the following of this faith. And then that impacts how I use my resources. Because I have limited resources, even if I am wealthy by other people's standards, they're still limited. And I use those not for myself, but for others. So that's a counter towards, say, consumerism or the pursuit of luxury and excess. But that has to be something that's taught. I guess my point is that your second person can find a way, I think, in thinking in terms of living for the flourishing of the society that is able to move alongside and engage well with others who don't hold the faith position, and accept that what I'm proposing as the solution will be moderated and changed by the collective voice at the table that includes others of the society who don't hold the faith position. In other words, if what I'm suggesting has merit, the merit would come out and could be maybe a concluded solution. So like to your example of education, I think it would be wise, as a historian, I would say it's absolutely wise to teach the Western foundation of this society. That's to some degree what we're leaning into here for the coming up episodes, this episode for sure, is that there is a foundation upon which our, as I've said, unique society is built upon. But if nobody knows that unique society or its foundational elements, that falls apart. Well, you cannot teach Western society without talking about the Bible. And so I'm going to do that as a historian. Every historian should do that. They may not do it the same way I would do it, but they should do that. So a society that's based on Western culture could say, yeah, I want that done. But that would sound different than saying, I want the Bible taught in schools.
Right.
Or I'm going to force the Bible to be taught in school in a way that can become proselytized. Or to go back to the economic sense and saying, hey, it'll be better if we do, if people are less in debt. So if somebody has a credit card, we're putting them in jail because they've gone to debt. And we think that's sinful. That's what the Christian nationalist kind of side of things, how it would propose things, that they would want to legislate morality. Of course, all law, as I said before, legislates morality, but they're wanting to legislate from a specific point of view, which is fine if I live in a nation that is 100% of a faith position.
Mm-hmm.
But the moment I say I'm living in a civic society, a civic entity, in a geographical constraints, the way I've described it before, and it's multicultural, well, then now I've got a whole different story that I can't impose that on people. But we're going to dig deeper into that as we go along and hopefully help flesh some of that out. There is nuance in it. By the way, when people who are Christians talk about the idea of Christian nationalism, most people that I know of, they back up. They're like, no, I'm not a Christian nationalist.
Right.
And there's lots of ways that somebody can, I looked this up in a political science book, or I looked this up on a website and I got this definition. And there's different aspects. I've handled it a little more loosely in just saying that somebody who's saying this is suggesting that this specific faith view should be the dominating posture upon which like all decisions are made. Like probably none of them would say we're going to make everybody become a Christian, but they're still going to be operating from a posture, at least the people that I know of or have read, have heard from, or some of personal friends, that the Bible or the Christian faith position should dictate down to everyone regardless. And that's not my posture. And that I think is unhelpful to us. And so we're another way to describe somebody who says that idea, to use an old phrase, which kind of links us into where we're going now, is to say you really want Christendom.
Right.
And the dumb part, D-O-M, is kind of kingdom. So it's like Christendom. Instead of kingdom, I'm having a Christdom, right? A Christ-controlled area, which if you're a Christian, you might say groovy. And there's whole theological conversations you're going to have about like, well, it's kind of what Jesus came to do, but his version is different than our version, the upside-down world, all that kind of stuff.
It reminds me of I can't remember which of the Matrix films it was, when somebody's talking to Morpheus, and he's like, not everybody believes as you do. He goes, my beliefs do not require them to.
That's right. That's episode 2. It's great. Yeah, it's Morpheus.
One shining moment in episode 2.
No, episode 2. He had
it's a whole other episode.
He had the Merovingian, and everybody's like, who's the Merovingian? I'm like, you don't know your Frankish history, obviously. If you know your Frankish history,
I am a little rusty. I will admit on my Frankish history.
Well, so having mentioned Christendom.
Yes.
This is, again, a term that was used, again, go online, you can Google a bunch of stuff. In English was not until the 12th century or so. But the idea then of a way to describe kind of all of Christians, I guess you could use other terms. Christendom, I guess it'd be a Buddhism or Islamic-dom, I guess. I don't know. But you're saying, hey, all the people that believe this faith, right? Secularist-dom, I suppose. And that's fair. However, historically, Christendom then is actually more connected, and the Encyclopedia Britannica says it this way: after the dissolution of the Roman Empire, the idea arose of Europe as one large church state. So the idea, as I just said, all decisions will be made, everything under the control of this certain faith position. Now, how do we get there is kind of what I want us to talk to, because part of what I'm trying to get to. So I said a word that may have thrown people a couple of episodes ago. I said Christians in the United States have become enculturated. So they have adopted the culture of this place rather than the other. And I've used some examples, for instance, multi-million-dollar buildings, music styles, some choices that they make, say, in technology, individually lives, how we live. We've mentioned this data point before, that people who know Christians do not see a difference in their lifestyle. And that can be both in a sense of like, do they cuss, are they alcoholics, right? But it also can be internally, different things like, do they see you go to church, or do they see you just doing what everybody else is doing? All those kinds of things. And so I said, and I firmly believe this, like this is our solution as Christian people. This is not necessarily the solution immediately for something about fixing the country. is that Christians need to disenculturate.
Yeah.
We need to separate out from that idea. Well, this idea of being enculturated is again a connection back to Christendom. It would be fine to be enculturated if 100% of the people in the United States were all practicing Christians. Then you could naturally say, well, everybody should have the same set of viewpoints about these key things that Jesus or the Bible have already dictated are the position to be held. Okay, fair. Yeah, great. Guess what? That's not our society. It actually has never been our society. Right. And sometimes when you hear people today moaning about being the minority culture, my way of saying it, they are looking back to the 50s when, as I said correctly, 85% of the people, at least to surveys, would claim to be Christians. They say, see, there's that moment. I want to stress it yet again. I am not saying, and I don't think you would say, that the 50s are some kind of golden age that we need to return to when America was somehow holy and pure and just. Were we a unique country? Yes. Did we do some things post-World War II that would, I think, easily be classified as good? Yes, including giving billions of dollars away, specifically to our former enemies from just 5 years before, in aiding people who were impoverished or their lands were destroyed, in not taking over their lands. There's a lot of positives you could say about the United States in the 1950s, but from a Christian point of view, that's not the golden age. And yet, when you hear people today talk, sometimes it feels like, again, they're thinking, hey, it's the time to go back to.
Yeah.
Right? Or, I mean, you and I have quoted some of the founders. So some people might say, oh, no, if we just could go back to 1776, that was the time. And I would again suggest to Christians, no, that's not the time. There's not been a time, particularly, here comes the guy I want to introduce today, post-Constantine, that we could say, the church has been living out this minority culture point of view. So ultimately, I want to take us back to about 1,800 years ago.
Okay.
All right. So we're going to be looking at some Roman history today.
Love it.
And the part of this that I'm trying to stress is to point out to people, again, on the sort of conservative Christian, i.e. Christian nationalist side, you're asking for something that only became true post-Constantine. And spoiler alert, that turned out to be a terrible outcome for Christianity as a faith and for the collective thing we call the church. Now, further spoiler alert, if you're a non-Christian, you're like, yeah, tell them, Carl. Make sure you're here next episode. Because the next episode, we got to look at what that means. I'll save that for later.
Nice.
Okay. So we got to go back, right? And to go back, what I think for this to really hit, you have to understand, what did Christianity look like? Now, we have several great ancient sources that we can look at for Christianity from the time after Jesus left, so say roughly 30 A.D., through the coming of Constantine, which is 320s, Milvian bridges earlier than that, but so roughly 300 years. So for 300 years, what did the faith look like? And this, when anybody studies this, which they rarely do, and there's some sources, maybe I should put them in the show notes for people on the podcast or on YouTube can look at, you can go read these books. And when you read these books and when you study these ancient documents, and you can get copies of the actual ancient letters from the church leaders at this time, you're going to be stunned because it's not the world that we know of in Christianity today.
Really?
So here's a short list, right?
Yeah.
And I like how one scholar said it, that if you looked at the Christian community in the days after Jesus, it's loose around the edges, but it's firm in the center.
Interesting.
And some of that is because not enough time had gone by. All right, so here's an example. All the leadership of the church was plural. There was no pastor. There's no senior leader.
Right.
There was sometimes a leader of the leaders, but you wouldn't have had anybody who was like the senior pastor.
The head guy.
Right.
Yeah.
Like we go to any church today, I don't care. You can know there are denominations of Christians out there who will say there's a group leadership, but still you go in, take me to your leader, and one dude's showing up.
Yep.
Secondly, women were highly involved and seen as equals, including in leadership. So women were central. If you know the Christian story at all, it's in there that women are the central position.
Yes.
Faith was open to anyone, not somebody who was of a certain certain civic structure, like a certain tribe of people. And this was radical. All other faiths that you know of going into this point of Jesus are like location specific.
Okay.
And it doesn't mean somebody would bar you if you wanted to become a worshiper of Isis or if you want to become a worshiper of Juno. Nobody would say, well, you can't, you're not a Roman, you're not an Egyptian. But in general terms, you wouldn't have. But here the Christians come along and it's really open to anybody. It was open to poor people. Typically, poor people was seen as basically a judgment of the gods. So you were poor because you're bad. So we don't want you around. You can't really participate. The resources of the group were shared collectively. Some people would go, that sounds like communism. Yeah, to some degree, Marx is leaning into that when he's talking about this idea. Now, there's some separation, so I'm not going to go too far down that road, but just note that. Their services were held on the first work day of the week. So there was no holiday day. They didn't have a cool day to do what they wanted to do, to plan stuff. So you just know they were either meeting super early or super late. It was not convenient.
Okay.
First work day. Now, that was the day we call Sunday, but it was the first work day of the week. Their service was basically a conglomerate of everybody kind of bringing things and sharing, and it was a reenactment that centered around a reenactment of the kind of very famous last meal that Jesus has with his team. These people typically called it a love feast. It was an actual meal, and at times they got in trouble for eating too much and not sharing, but nonetheless, there was a meal that they had together. As you move into the 2nd century, the 3rd century, you see the shifting from the original followers kind of leading things to passing this on to kind of disciples, and those guys kind of would take on the role, but again, always a collective and leadership. And then the kind of the last thing they would do with the services is by the time you get to the end of the 1st century, so say 80, 90, 100 AD, they had the writings that we call the New Testament, and they would use those and study those, and they'd kind of hang out together. So that's the Christian church. Active in the world that they lived in, usually very poor, seen as weirdos. They were considered a cult. They didn't worship the right worship places. They were maligned, and at different places they were kind of attacked for their weirdness. They were seen as oddballs. One of the things I love, this ancient document talks about how weird they were because they wouldn't share their wives. Because in Roman culture, it was
that was the norm.
It was the norm.
It's not a swingers. It's just that's the buy-in.
Yep. And if I want to be with your wife, I can do that, and I can ask you. You can say yes or no, I suppose. But it was sort of seemed to be assumed
it's a neighborly thing to do.
Yep, you would share. And again, for the women listening, the women had no voice in this, no agency. So here the Christians came along and said, nope, that's not allowed because the woman is equal to the man. And in fact, in one of the writings, the man is told to submit to the woman, submit equally to the woman as your wife. And so there's a whole thing, we're going to talk more about this later, but there's a whole shifting of marriage. The Romans were like, that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard of. Why would you, A, want to honor women, and then why would you not want to have sex with any woman you could because there she is?
These guys are perverts.
Well, we would say it's an early Me Too movement type thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But notice who's protecting the women. Right? This is the thing. People don't know this story.
Yeah.
All right, so you good so far?
Yeah, man. This is good.
Okay, so the Roman Empire is doing its thing. And begins, Octavian, all that kind of stuff. Eventually they get to the end of good leadership. That happens in roughly 180. So there's a group of Roman leaders who are called the 5 good emperors. And so they end. After that, there begins this period of chaos that's going to ultimately be solved or attempted to be solved by a man named Diocletian.
Okay.
All right, so right into Diocletian. So you have this 5, think of having 5 really good presidents in a row.
That'd be great.
I won't touch that. 5 good presidents in a row. And then what happened afterwards was a series in 50 years, they had 26 emperors. Now, for us, we're like, well, every 2 years, that's not bad. But they had people be the emperors for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And, of course, you're not voting on this. So having a good leader, let him be the leader, right? And what happened was basically the society's leadership devolved into chaos. And there was a lot of assassinations, and basically whoever had the biggest army, it's why it's called the barracks emperors, because whoever could control an army in the barracks would get somebody to support them, they'd kill each other. All right, at the end of that mess, Diocletian shows up. Okay. That he was a bodyguard in the last emperor who gets assassinated. No, actually, he dies, but his 2 sons are after him, and they both get assassinated. So now everybody's looking around going, now what? We just basically killed everybody that we didn't like for a long time, and so do we have an option? Diocletian steps up to the plate, and he decides we have to make some reforms. All right, so this is all pre-setting up. We're going to get to Constantine. Short version is he says, hey, look, the empire's too big. Actually, historically, I would argue that point with him, but nonetheless, is too big, and he's going to split it, and the parts that he splits again. And what he's trying to do is evolve a system of secession. So we won't be killing each other and having assassination. We're not going to have elections, of course, because we're an empire. We don't do that. But we're going to have a setup so that when I retire or die, there's a guy who's had practice, and he gets to be the next guy.
Okay.
Then they'll find another dude who has practice, and he kind of takes one of the smaller spots. Okay? So he's going to try and do this thing. However, he's got another problem. And his problem are these weirdo Christians. Because the Christians have grown. Now, it's really difficult to get the good handle on how many people there were. You don't have great records in this regard. And you'll find historians all over the map on this. Some will say it was as low as 10%. I think that's ridiculous. It's clearly 20%. It may have been as high as 35%. But so he's got this problem because these Christians are not good citizens. They're not willing to worship like everybody else.
Right.
So the Romans were highly religious and had a very ornate and multifaceted kind of religious structure. At the center of it by this point was the worship of the emperor. So this did not really start with Octavian when you start the empire, but it sort of starts with Octavian. It kind of builds out from there. And so by this point, the emperor is seen as one of the gods and should be worshipped. And the Christians are like, yeah, we're not doing any of that stuff. And so Diocletian thought that he could, to some degree, build enthusiasm for himself and his changes by giving the society an enemy to attack, and the enemy to attack are these weirdo Christians. So he basically begins another time of kind of persecution against the Christians. All right, you with me so far?
Yeah, it's history echoing again, but yes.
Yeah, I don't want to bore you with it, but it all sets. You don't understand Constantine if you don't understand Diocletian. Mm-hmm. Both Diocletians attempted at reforms, because this kind of is how Constantine gets his. Like, how's this guy even come on the stage? Yeah. So he's in the mix of these guys in secession. So the short answer. But then what he does, because this is the kind of the trigger point of the whole story. So Diocletian makes Christianity illegal. He makes the gatherings illegal. He goes through a process of arresting most of the Christian leaders, many of who will spend a couple of years or so in prison. Some will be executed. He doesn't execute everybody. Mm-hmm. He goes out of his way to try to discover the Christian writings that I mentioned had by the end of the first century had become throughout all the different churches. They had copies, and eventually they'll get to the 27 books that we know of as the New Testament. That's by like the 180s, 200s or so. And he tries to burn them, which, side point, the fact that we still have these resources is part of how Christianity is such a highly sustained, historical, truthful thing because of the historical evidence that we have. Diocletian was going out of his way to destroy all these documents. So kind of putting away the leaders, persecuting people, bringing social ostracism on people, threatening their citizenship. If you don't revoke, we could deal with your citizenship. If they weren't citizens anymore, that would have a lot to do with their standing in court, their ability to have jobs, to start businesses. There were some torture events. The faith had grown through the army. Some of that is due to some things that happened back with that guy Paul we talked about last episode, mentioned him in passing. He's one of the more famous dudes who followed Jesus. And because of his arrests, he had infiltrated the army, basically, and led a bunch of people to become faith followers within the army, and so that had grown through all that time. So Diocletian says, we got to find these guys. Yeah. So he goes after them, and he basically puts tremendous pressure. Now, there's a whole subtext to that you could look into about how Christians respond to pressure, but that's not really our point. All right, so he's making these reforms, both government reforms and religious reforms. The religious reforms are getting rid of this cult, this group of weird freaks who are causing all these problems. You with me?
Yeah, getting rid of them towards the end of consolidating his own power. And
right, exactly.
It's not necessarily that he is antithetical towards them. I'm sure he was, but it's a means to an end.
It is a means to an end, which is a good hint for Constantine. 305, he abdicates, which is interesting because he could have stayed forever. Remember I told you he split the empire, right. So he's like number one on one part of the empire. And so he's got another number one on the other part. That dude also abdicates. So I think he talked about it and said, okay, let's step down. Let's put our plan into practice. So they do. They step up. The guy who steps up on the opposite side, so this is in the West, is Constantine's dad.
Okay.
You say so. Constantine's dad steps up into the story. His name, just to make it more difficult for all of us, is Constantius.
He's Romans.
That's okay.
No
I'm Carl.
No wonder the empire didn't survive.
I'm Carl Jr. So I mean,
See, that's at least understandable.
That's at least understandable. You're right. So basically, the plan of having secession falls apart quickly. And it falls apart for the reason you would imagine, because people are prideful and they want power. So Constantine had thought, I'll be the new number 2 under Dad. Well, Dad dies a year into his rule. When he dies, he says, yeah, I want my boy to get the position. But in the intervening year, another guy had been given the position. So that, there's more to study. If you're really interested in Roman history, you can go down and kind of have examination on that point. The short version, again, is that then Constantine feels ripped off. He's like, I got ripped off here. My dad was going to hook me up. I was going to be the guy. He had obviously personally been raised in the imperial palace. He had actually served in the army under Diocletian. So he'd been trained to be a good soldier and a good general and all this kind of stuff. And so he begins to say, hey, I should get my fair share. And apparently the only way I can get my fair share is to fight for it. And keep in mind, it had only been 20 years or so since the 26 barracks emperors, and that had been the pattern.
Right.
Remember, children are only products of the culture. So they only know what the culture's shown them. So Constantine had grown up and others had, you want it, you go take it.
Right. So
he's like, I'm going to go take it. So between 305 and 307, so basically from the time of Diocletian, there's about 6 different people in the West. In the East, where Diocletian had been, there was a civil war there too, but not as much. So they're kind of doing their own thing. But in the West, there's this fight. So Constantine does this fight. It all leads up to in 312. So in 312, he has gathered his army. He's taken out some of his opponents, and he's marching down to face off against his last opponent. It's a guy named Maxentius. And he also, by the way, had been the son of one of the former leaders, the other guy who had abdicated, and he also had not been elevated, so he felt ripped off. I think probably what Diocletian and Constantine and those guys were trying to do was say, hey, let's not make secession about bloodline. That's noble. That's cool.
It's at least a step forward.
They probably should have told Constantine and Maxentius this is the plan, so they could say, okay, I'll sign off on that. I doubt they did. And so those two guys were like, hey, my dad was in charge, and I want this.
Yeah, these guys don't respect nepotism. This is a time-honored tradition. This is politics, baby.
Exactly. So Maxentius had been in Rome. Rome's no longer important. Actually, when they had split the empire, the new dude in charge in the West had moved away from Rome to Milan. So it's very important in the North. So now it's just down to Maxentius and Constantine to have a fight. The night before the fight, what Constantine tells us, this is in 312, he comes down to have a fight. The fight's at a place that's known as Milvian Bridge. There's a bridge, I think it's a Milvian Bridge. On the night before the battle's about to fight, Constantine says he looked into the sky. Some reports are that he had a dream, or he had a dream and he looked into the sky. And he saw like a cross or a symbol in the sky. And he later described what he saw as using the Greek letters chi and rho, which of course, that's chi is the C, and it can also stand for CH, and rho is the R. So the CH and the R, I wish I could show it to you, but it looks like a kind of an X with a P in it. If you've seen any religious symbols from the time of, say, 0 to 1000 AD, you've seen this symbol before. And the chi rho was the first 2 letters of the word Christ. And so that he said that he had a vision from either an angel or from Jesus himself who showed up and said, in this sign, conquer. In this sign, you'll be victorious. So he got up the next day against the complaints of many of his soldiers, and he began to paint the chi rho onto all the shields of his soldiers and paint it kind of using, on flags, Because what he understood was that Jesus had said, if you will use this sign, I will give you victory in this battle.
This is your lucky charm.
You'll be the guy in charge.
Wow.
You'll be the selected favored one if you'll just make a claim for me based on putting this on your I could see some ball caps with this right now. And he fights the battle and he wins. So there's a sense in which you could say from the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, Constantine's position was that Jesus, had helped him win this battle because he, Constantine, had put this symbol on his shields and kind of wore it boldly.
Right.
And in the battle, he won. After he wins, he goes to Milan, which is the headquarters, and he issues an edict. And it's known as the Edict of Milan, easy enough.
I like it.
And in the Edict of Milan, the outcome of that was that there'd be no more persecution. Christians were allowed a legal standing. So he basically, now the Diocletian persecution had ended when Diocletian in 305, but just the legacy of like maybe not being a citizen, people being in jail, you're this weird cult group, you're these weird freaks. Constantine, now I'm in charge of the West. I've defeated everybody who needed to be defeated. I am the sole guy in charge of the Roman Empire in the West. I'm going to make it legal for Christians. And he does this like the very next year, Edict of Milan. So some people will go, I don't really believe he had a vision. I think that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. And my point would be that let's not argue about that part. All right, let's just look at historically what happened. You got the Civil War happening. This guy comes along, and he throws his lot in with this minority group who had just the previous decade been seen as weirdos and freaks and crazy people.
Yeah, and a threat.
Right. Now, why would he do that?
Why would he do that?
Got an idea? Got a guess?
I mean, what's the ultimate motivation to hold on to power? I would think.
Right. I think that's a fair answer. Now, again, there's a long-standing, which we will not get into, debate about whether Constantine was truly a Christian or not, or did he truly have the vision or not. That he painted the Chi-Rho on his shields, that's absolute.
Yes.
He did that. Did he make the Edict of Milan? Absolute. He did that.
Right.
Now, go back to what I said to you about the data, right? If there's only 10% Christians throughout the entire empire, which means both halves of the empire, is that really going to be a benefit for him?
Interesting.
Probably not.
That's a great quote, yeah.
In all likelihood, the view that many people, that not everybody, but I certainly hold that Christians were probably even north of 30%, maybe even to 35% of the empire, makes the most sense. Because here you are fighting a civil war. You've fought 5 or 6 other guys, meaning the people you've conquered don't suddenly fall in love with you. So you need to find a way to get a weight on the scales on your side of popularity. And who's sitting there but this large group of people who nobody cares for.
Yeah.
Nobody likes. So he kind of plucks them out and says, hey, I'm with you guys. It's a brilliant move.
Interesting.
Again, maybe I'm the one who's a little cynical and that I don't find a lot of evidence that he himself became a Christian, quote unquote. However, that's not our core point here. Our core point is what happened to the Christian faith. So we've pointed out that previously you have the Christians living in a certain way, seen as the oddballs. Their society was an antithesis to Roman society on a variety of metrics. Another thing that they were noted for that was so weird was that they spent their own money on the poor. Because, as I said to you, a lot of societies, Roman societies saw this, poor people was a judgment of the gods. So you kind of let them be poor, and if they die, well, that's better for the rest of us.
Right.
That's kind of the posture. And these Christians were actually caring for them out of their own money, including people who weren't Christians. So they did use their money for each other, but they also used their money for people who weren't Christians. It's so Constantine's coming along and he's like, I'm going to pull this group in and they're going to be helps to me. All right, so I want to pause there for a minute because, again, it's a lot of history and a lot of times people's eyes glaze over, and I want to make sure I don't lose you or lose anybody else. You with me so far?
Yeah, I'm intrigued. I'm leaning forward.
Okay, so the empire's in trouble. Diocletian has some reforms. They don't work out the way he wants. Part of the way in, he's going to attack this weird group of people who I'm suggesting is as many as 30% of the empire. Constantine comes along, he's fighting, he wants to find a way to really lock in his victory. He's won militarily, but he wants to win hearts and minds. How can I do that? I bring this group in that's maligned and just a decade or so ago were illegal. I don't make them legal.
Yeah.
More than that, I'm going to elevate them. Now, it takes another decade before he's able to consolidate the whole empire. So he goes all the way back to the opposite of what Diocletian did. There's another guy over in the Eastern Empire. It's a long story, which I don't want to bore you with. There's another battle about 12 years later, and Constantine wins. So now he's in charge. This, by the way, if you're interested, is when Constantine will begin to think, I should build a new capital. Rome's a cesspool, which it had become. And Milan, he wants to go to Milan. I'm going to build a new place. And he basically picks over in where the land masses between Europe and Asia fit, right there on the border of modern-day Turkey. Well, it's actually in modern-day Turkey today, modern-day Istanbul. And he will build a city. Of course, he'll name it after himself, Constantinople.
All right.
Okay. So now what happens here? And this is the takeaway. What does Constantine do? Now, once he's in charge, he begins a wholesale policy to elevate Christianity. And again, maybe that's because he becomes a Christian. We're not going to argue whether he is or isn't. We just want to look at what did it mean.
Yeah. He
makes Sunday a holiday. Now, he does this not only to worship or honor Jesus, that he rose on Sundays, the first work day. Now will become, if you like weekends, think Constantine.
All right. Thanks, Constantine.
He's the guy, right? He's also worshiping the Roman sun god Sol Invictus, which is connected to Apollo. So he seemed to be playing both sides. He has some coins minted.
Like a politician.
Yeah, good politician that he was. He spends state funds to build churches. So he begins to build churches with state money.
Okay.
He puts Christian leaders on the payroll and basically begins demands the process of where Christianity moves away from plural leadership to single leadership. Now, there's a whole conversation we could have about these words that you may have heard of, like bishop and priest, and we're not touching that, although we could if somebody wants to ask questions ask some questions. Maybe we'll take us an episode to kind of answer those questions. But you go from the plural to the singular, which is really kind of important. He makes paying the Christian tithe, which is an idea that Christians should, as I just said, share their resources with others. He makes it basically a state tax. So everybody's got to pay this thing. And he basically demands that everybody in the empire become a Christian. So everybody has to become a Christian. And he places himself at the kind of center of this whole thing. So Christianity now becomes wrapped up where the emperor is he's getting the worship as the emperor because he's at the center of the faith, while at the same time still kind of saying, well, we are worshiping Jesus. And this is really the beginning of the church-state thing that we argue about when you look historically at kind of that whole thing, right? And then you can see that best in 325, so just a few years after his last big battle. He himself calls and demands the church leaders come to Nicaea. He goes himself. He kind of chairs the meetings. So again, you kind of go away from the Christians themselves having meetings or gatherings about different aspects to having, in our world we say, the president calling a meeting of all the church leaders, and you come to this city, and I want to be there, and I, the president, am going to chair the meeting, and we're going to force you to come to some conclusion. Now, Nicaea does some cool stuff if you're interested in the Christian faith. There's some things to examine about that. That's not our point. Our point is to see how Constantine's coming is now changing what the faith is. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that's some radical change in a short amount of time.
Yeah, you could summarize it this way. Christianity and people who follow the faith goes from being the powerless to being the powerful. They go from being the persecuted to being the persecutors. The group leadership that included women goes to single leader with women banished. And you see basically the church taking on the auspices of Rome.
Wow.
Within 100 years, the church itself is like a Roman institution. And the leaders of the churches wearing the same clothing that the Romans would have worn in certain leaders of position, using certain titles that were used within this positions. And when the empire in the West falls, so the Roman Empire falls in the 400s, the way I describe it in my classes is that the Christian church becomes the social glue, holding whatever crumbs are left of the old empire. And they are able to do that because they're the last Roman institution standing. Now, there's maybe some positives out of that, which we'll look at next time. But the point is just to stop for a second as we kind of come to the end of the episode and step back and remember what I said about what the church looked like, and then look at what it becomes. It goes from being the minority culture to being the majority culture. But in doing so, it goes from a place of kind of walking in alignment with Jesus's upside down world to aligning itself with the power structure of the civic government in the quite normal ways we said last time, the kind of trifecta of human boasting, right, of wealth and power and privilege. It's a devolving. It's not an evolving. It's going away from the things that Jesus said, not going in the direction that Jesus said.
Yeah. It almost like it denatures, right? When a protein gets heated up or something or other, it expands, but it also fundamentally changes chemically speaking, in a irrevocable way. So, in such a short time.
Yeah, it happened really quick.
Wow.
Now, there's still probably another century to go. There's some back and forth. Christianity is not the legal religion until 380, so about 60 years later. And it doesn't fully take on the structure of persecution until that 400s. And I say persecution, what I'm really meaning is a demand of following. Like, you must obey these things. Christianity, in Christendom, this probably isn't weird, but they take over the courts. As a Christian myself, I don't want there to be a Christian court in our society today, or a court that's going to make its rulings strictly like from a biblical point of view or Bible-centric, find this verse, have this ruling kind of thing.
Right.
And yet that's the position they go to. And then there's other things go down the road of some centuries that people might naturally know about, like the Crusades or the Inquisition, those kinds of things. We may touch on those later. But my point is just a note for people who say, hey, Christianity, we want a Christian nation, or we would have a Christian president, or there's a certain person to elect that will enact Christian laws. Like, we've been down this road before. Remember last episode, we were talking about how God's got a certain way he wants, and his frustration with his people was that you weren't living this way. They were, in essence, generally living that way for those 2 centuries. In fact, I remember I said there's no golden age in 1950 or 1776. Right. If we want to find a golden age, go back to the 1st and 2nd century of the Christian faith. But to do that, you have to accept persecution. You have to accept minority culture. You have to accept radical differences from what you probably assume being a Christian or being in a church actually means. And actually, I think that would be beneficial for us. I mean, but even if you're just think about this, if you're a Christian, the way in to faith historically was to accept the story and to believe and say, I assent to this. And then in some churches, there was a very kind of difficult path before you could officially be a member. And that shifted over to, well, if you're born here, you're in. But now think about what that means. A person who hasn't have to make a really intentional decision themselves are less likely to be devoted to the thing, particularly if it costs them somehow. And if you've blurred the lines between what it means to be part of a group, it's kind of easy to see why you begin to look like the normal human state rather than the upside down alternative view that Jesus has. And that's kind of, I guess, where we are. I mean, the changes for me are drastic. When I think of women, what happened to women afterwards, when I think of how leadership goes from a plural, I think of the idea of the whole society being taxed, for leaders to be on kind of the state payroll so they can kind of make decisions and those kinds of things. I mean, those things are, I believe those are not positive. And the Christian faith as a idea suffers and is negatively impacted. And I think it leaves then a negative impact thereafter. Now, one could then argue, and we'll look at this next episode, we're wrapping up here, well, then that should mean we should just not have Christianity at all. And so there's questions we want to deal with, particularly if I'm not a Christian and I'm listening to the podcast. Well, why would I want to have Christianity involved. So we are going to deal with that issue. But just for now, I kind of want that to kind of sober in and settle in that Christendom's not the path we want. The Christian nation, Christian nationalism, that kind of viewpoint, that's not what God asked for. And when we saw it happen in 300, it did not work out well. Last episode, we saw what God did ask for. And it's that upside down kind of world that's an interior thing for individuals, not a civic thing at the larger level. And now we saw they were actually sort of doing it for 2 centuries, 3 centuries. And then it all went away because of choices that were made relative to power and wealth. And again, that trifecta of human boastings kind of thing. Man.
Looking forward to seeing where the story goes next.
All right. Well, hopefully people will come back again. If you got questions, put them, in the notes. Email me at the information. Do it in the YouTube notes. Would love to engage with you in conversation if you have questions about this. And we'll look for you in the next episode.
Love it.
Thanks for joining us on Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have any questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/unmoored.